Okay, good morning, everybody. Welcome to the April 10th Fire Safe San Mateo County meeting. Today we have Alex and Shanali from NIST. NIST is the National Institute of Standards and Technology. And last year, they did a really wonderful experiment on auxiliary structures and separation from, I guess, primary dwellings. And they did it last year. It was very successful. A lot of information was received from it. And they have a report TN 2253, which I went ahead and sent out in the link in the agenda, and I can send it out again if you do need it. Alex is a fire protection engineer at NIST. And Shanali, I just learned this morning, is a materials engineer at NIST, which I didn't even know there was such a thing, and thank you so much for being one, Shanali. So the information I think that they're going to present today is very important. We have a lot of sheds. We know ignitions happened from these sheds, primary structures. And so
I'm having audio problems. I'm going to try one more time to get out and get back in, Denise.
Okay,
Just
all
bear
right.
with me, okay?
No problem. No problem. Okay, so Alex is just fine-tuning his connection. He's in Maryland and in the Beltway, and unfortunately, he doesn't have a great bandwidth out there. Too many people online out there in Maryland, I guess. So this experiment, I think, lasted for a day. They did multiple versions of the experiment, and Shanali can talk about that. And why I wanted to have them explain the summary is because the report is fairly technical, but I think it would be really great for planning commissions, ASCC, HOAs, to be able to gather this information and say, okay, placement of sheds, which are usually exempt from Chapter A, they, and Alex will talk about this, where they're usually unpermitted structures. So they potentially can be very dangerous in terms of ignition of primary structures that have been built to 7A. So Shanali, I'm not sure if Alex is able to get back on. Let's see. Looks like he is.
Yes, and he's readmitted, but I don't know if he's established
I don't know if he
contact yet.
Yeah. So I'm going to turn off my video and I'm going to go ahead and mute myself. Shanali, if you wanted to just share your screen maybe and start the presentation, and we'll wait for Alex.
I can do that.
Okay.
Of course, this is my part of presentation. Alex has
slides. Now I can hear you. I'm having some serious internet issues. But I think we can, Shanali, since you're sharing, go ahead and go to the beginning, and then I'll start, and then you can just move the slides for me. It's easy enough. There are only 10 slides.
All right. Okay. I can do that. That should work. All right.
Okay. Great. Thank you for having us, everyone. Glad to be back to share with you some of our structure separation work. I'm going to give about 9-10 introductory slides, and then I'm going to turn it over to Shanali, who's going to go in depth on the experiments and findings from the structure separation work, specifically on the sheds. So we know structure-to-structure fire spread is a very important issue in the WUI. And we see this with large structures, i.e. residences. As you see on the picture on the right, this is in Paradise during the campfire and where the entire parcel was on fire. So you can envision a structure anywhere from 6 to 20, 30 feet away, getting exposed and readily ignited. But that's not the only issue. We're seeing this all the way to very small structures, specifically sheds. We're seeing this in the field, not just in California, but all around the country. And this is a problem because these are unregulated in many parts or most parts of the country. And we see destruction from shed to structure fire ignitions. Next, Shonali. So I'm going to cover the first four themes and highlights here, and then Shonali is going to pick up the remaining three. So we're going to talk about legislative mandates, the issue with the sheds. Not only they're unregulated, but they're very effective use vectors for moving fire from one parcel to another. Frequently, sheds are placed near the edge of the property, and combustible sheds can ignite from combustible fences. We have seen this, and we can have this hopscotching across parcels. HMM tells us we need to look at both fire and embers. The work here is specifically focused on fire, under the assumption that all the ember hardening will be done at the structure. And one of the main points you're going to see here discussed is that we need to look at this at the community level, not at the parcel level, particularly for moderate and high density construction. I'll summarize by saying that codes add value, but their minimums are not enough. All right. And then Shonali will cover the experiments, the findings, the guidance table, limitations, and then point you to some implementation examples. Next, Shonali, please. So you have seen this before, but I want this to be the technical anchor for our discussions, acknowledging that it is really the balance between the hardening and the exposure reduction that is going to yield the benefits that we want, i.e., that we will not ignite our primary residences. So we always have to harden for embers. We have to deal with fire when appropriate. And it is the balance between the two that's going to give us that desired outcome. Next. So that covers exactly that. In some cases, we have the option to reduce the exposure using the 3 R's in HMM: reduce, remove, relocate. In other cases, we have to harden the structure. It's always better to reduce the exposure first because the hardening does have limitations. Next. So I want to take a minute here to look at both of these paths and how they can be used in the real world. Let's make one click, Shonali. So fire science help us understand those relationships between reducing exposure and hardening of the structure. One more click. So it's a little busy, but bear with me. So on the hardening of the structure, we have a number of vulnerabilities. Some of them can and are regulated. You can take as an example the vents in California in the WUI code that require a listed product. But there are other things that are not regulated, specifically going to the eaves. They're unprotected, even though there is a layer in the roof deck, the eaves are open, there are no requirements there. And this is one of many, many, many examples of vulnerabilities that are not regulated. So if we look at these non-regulated vulnerabilities, there are two paths that we can take. One is to address the retrofit, and one is to look at new construction. So putting them in new construction is a matter of changing the code, which is a heavy lift, but it is doable, whether it is at the state level or at the local level. The retrofit is a different animal. And the retrofit, once we go in that space, AHJ is the authority having jurisdiction. When we look at the retrofit space, there are two options. One is we can go with a voluntary adoption. So best practices, we educate the public. There might be some lifestyle changes, but I put it in orange because we may get some things to happen. We may not get things to happen. It's voluntary, it's ad hoc. The other way is using a paradigm shift through jurisdiction and mission changes, get people to change things, to force change in the existing building stock. I know this is a heavy lift, that's why we call it the paradigm shift, but that may be necessary, particularly in moderate and high density construction, because ad hoc has significant repercussions throughout the community. So that is something I want you guys to think seriously about on the hardening of the structure. Now let's look at the reducing exposure. Shanali, one more. So there we look at parcel, community, and by community I mean neighbors, wildlands, multiple jurisdictions. Going forward, we have the same idea. It can be voluntary, or we can enter into a paradigm shift mindset where we look at cross-boundary mitigation, and that's going to require significant jurisdictional and mission changes. And I appreciate that this is a very heavy lift, particularly when you go from community to outside, not necessarily as heavy a lift as you may think for inside the community. And I'm going to give you a specific example here. When we look at cross-boundary mitigation within the community, one way to deal with this is by implementing setbacks at the property line. So yes, you can have your shed, but you cannot move your shed away from your house and next to my house. Those setbacks can really change how we deal with those fuel density issues that Shanali is going to talk about next. Next, Shanali. So this is a perfect example. The figure on the right, you have seen this before when we presented HMM to you, but this on the right, we have one lot with two residences. So if we want to put a regulated shed, we need setbacks from both structures, typically 30 or 40 feet, depending on the specifics. If you take the same layout of those two residences, but now you have a two-lot situation, that shed has to be away from the residence in lot 1 by 30 or 40 feet, depending on the code and construction. But right now, most codes allow for very limited setback, 3 to 5 feet from the property line, putting it extremely close, dangerously close to the parcel next door. So we can remedy this type of situation by implementing setback. You will see another slide here shortly highlighting how codes add value. They're minimums. They have been built historically on a parcel-centric approach, not exposure-centric foundation, and that's why we're seeing now some of these parcel-to-parcel problems. We need to acknowledge this spatial distribution within the communities, particularly for fuels that act as wicks, i.e. fences, and auxiliary structures, specifically sheds. I also want to stress that codes are consensus-driven. Their effectiveness is related to adoption. These are all things you know. Enforcement is an issue, and they don't just impact construction, but they also can impact lifestyle. Because if we implement some of those setbacks, there are going to be situations where we force the fuel reduction at the parcel level to enable us to enhance the ignition resistance of the community. Next. So let's look at what codes buy us. One click, Shanali. So this is a situation where we have a small shed, and all the data on this slide is information that that comes from what you'll hear directly from Shanali. So this is actual data from our real world experiments. One more click. So in this particular shed, a small shed, in this particular case, a small shed 10 feet away is not far enough for a non-WUI code compliant structure. Next. Now, if we make that structure WUI compliant, in this particular case, that same shed, next, works. So the code adds value, all right? For the same density, in this case, the code adds value. Let's go one more, Shanali. And one more. But the code has limitations. You cannot take this and keep compressing the fuels, because in this case, if you take that small shed and you put it 5 feet away, as you will see in a few minutes, even a code compliant house will not work and will burn down. One more. So we can take that shed and push it away. So if you look at the top left, we said 10 feet doesn't work. You can move it further out and still be okay in the context of a non-WUI compliant code, but you have to be mindful about the neighbor. One more click, Shanali. And one more. So you see that the code saves space if you compare the upper right and the lower middle, but there are, one more click, there are small parcel limitations, all right? And that's what I want you to really start thinking about when you think about sheds in your community. You cannot just think about one shed, one structure. You have to think about the shed in the context of all the surrounding parcels. Next. So we've talked about structure separation. This is a multi-phase effort. One more click, Shanali. Right now, we're focusing on sheds. Shanali will talk about the sheds. From our experiments that we have done in the last several years, we have identified an eave vent vulnerability. So before we move on to the other phases, phase 2 and phase 3 of the experiments, we are addressing this by doing several complex series on eaves and vents, which incidentally, the first experiment is starting tomorrow on campus. So I'm going to stop here. One more click, Shanali, and then that's, so those are the experiments that I wanted to relate to you from the codes slide, you know, a couple of slides back. These are all of our partners. And I'm going to turn it over to Shanali, who's going to go in depth into the experiments and findings. Shanali, take it away.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you for setting the scene. And all that was presented by Alex is derived from the experiments that we did at NIST. I will be talking about the fire hazard of the residential storage sheds. And these are typically small sheds that store gardening tools. People store gasoline, propane cylinders, and items made up of wood, plastic, and rubber. This slide shows the research overview and what I'm going to go through my presentation. I will be talking about the fire hazard of storage sheds. I will cover the 2 experimental series, the indoor and the outdoor test series, where we looked into the effects of construction material of the sheds, the effect of fuel loading, effects of structure separation distance between the shed and the primary structure, and also the effect of winds. I will go through the experimental findings and how we can implement them in the WUI communities. And most importantly, I will be talking about the limitations of this experimental series. So it is very important to consider the limitations that are attached to this experimental series and how we implement the technical findings. So small sheds, typically small residential storage sheds are placed next to the primary structure. Here are some examples of small storage sheds, and you can see here this is a steel shed that is placed next to the exterior wall of a primary structure. Then you have a plastic shed in the neighboring parcel, again placed next to the exterior wall. And this is flammable, and you can see the flammable fence in between the two parcels and the sheds. So the plastic closet and the plastic small shed is placed against the exterior wall. If the shed or the contents of the shed ignite, it is very easy for the flames to spread to the combustible fence and then onto the next parcel. Here, again, this is a plastic shed placed next to the primary structure. Again, this is placed under the window of the top floor. And as we show in our experiments, that if this shed ignites, the flames from the burning of these sheds can easily reach up to the window. Once the window is compromised, the whole structure gets compromised because the flames and the embers will enter the structure, and the whole primary structure can be compromised very easily. So the fire hazard of the storage sheds that are placed very close or next to the primary residence is significant. And currently, California is only regulating sheds that have floor area of 120 square feet. These small sheds shown in this slide have the floor area of less than 30 square feet, and hence these are not regulated. And we will show through our experiments that there is a significant fire hazard associated even with these small storage sheds.
So we do get
This slide shows a fuel agglomeration.
Anybody.
Sorry. Okay. This slide shows the fuel agglomeration where the fire hazard is further amplified. If the plastic shed or the contents of the shed ignites, everything around the shed is combustible. The privacy fence, the trash can, and the deck here can burn and spread the fire very rapidly to the primary structure. We also show through our experiments that the plastic shed melts and flows, thus carrying the flames along with it, further spreading the fire from the source fire. The fire hazard of these storage sheds is attenuated in WUI and high-density communities in particular. Currently, there is no guidance on placement of these small storage sheds. So the goal of this study was to provide guidance for the placement of small storage sheds with floor area less than 120 square feet in WUI and high-density housing communities. Since this was a huge undertaking, we split the experiments in two parts. The first was the indoor shed burn experiments, and based on the knowledge gained from the indoor experiments, we conducted the outdoor shed burn experiments with applied wind. So for the indoor experiments, the primary objective was to characterize the burning behavior of small storage sheds. In these experiments, we tested sheds of different sizes, construction materials, different fuel loadings, and different separation distances between the shed and the primary structure. This slide shows different types of sheds and different sizes that were tested during the indoor test burn series. You have two different sizes of sheds. Here you have a closet with a storage capacity of less than 75 cubic feet. And this is a slightly larger shed, and we call it a very small shed because we have much larger sheds in the subsequent experiments. And the very small shed had a storage capacity of 150 cubic feet. And we tested wood, plastic, and steel sheds. The sheds were tested with 2 levels of fuel loading, low and high, and we used 1A wood cribs. As the fire behavior of this wood cribs is very well studied and documented. We wanted the burning of the fuel loading to be reproducible so that we could distinguish and characterize the burning behavior of the sheds made up of different materials. And hence we use this consistent fuel loading using 1A wood cribs. And here you can see for high fuel loading, for the closet, we use 4 cribs. For low fuel loading, we have used 2 cribs in the closet. So this is the experimental matrix. We burned around 9 sheds indoors, and the 3 types of materials that were tested was plastic, wood, and steel. The wood cribs were ignited using a tray of heptane, and the sheds were allowed to burn until all the fuel was consumed. This slide shows the burning behavior of combustible wood closet. A wood closet with 4 wood cribs generated significant amount of heat exposure, and the roof of the wood closet was completely consumed in fire, and you can see that the flames are shooting out. All of the fuel content in the shed is now exposed to the surrounding combustibles and the primary structure, whatever is next to the shed. And you can see that the flames go as high as 16 feet. And these were the indoor experiments, but imagine if we had wind here, this flame, the plume could lean onto the primary structure and ignite the primary structure very easily. So for the wooden sheds, all of the structure is destroyed. The fuel content within the shed is exposed, and within 10 minutes of ignition of the fuel. This slide shows the burning behavior of plastic shed. The plastic shed melted and deformed within 5 minutes from the ignition of the wood crib. For the shed burn, we used a metal pan to contain the flammable liquid. The molten plastic burned as pool fire in the pan, indicating a higher fire hazard of plastic sheds, i.e. the molten plastic would flow and carry the flames along with it. So even if the plastic sheds are moved away from the primary residential structure, the molten pool can act as a ladder fuel and ignite the surrounding fuels. The plastic shed burned with very high intensity and generated a significant heat exposure. And in technical terms, we say the peak heat release rate of this particular shed was 6 megawatts. We then tested the steel shed. The non-combustible steel shed generated the lowest heat exposure, and the duration of this shed burn was significantly longer. As you can imagine, the non-combustible steel structure remained intact, and it took longer for the fuel loading to burn. However, this particular shed, because the structure is intact, the only way out for the flames is through the door opening, and you can see the flames jetting from the door opening. So this flame jetting generated very high intensity exposures, as we can see in the subsequent experiments. This can also lead to very quick fire spread to the primary structure. So in general, the experimental findings of the indoor experiments indicated that the free shed burn experiment showed good repeatability and reproducibility of the measured data, which was very important for us. The wood and plastic shed contributed approximately 60% increase in the fuel load, in addition to the fuel loading that goes inside the shed. So wood and plastic, again, adds to the fuel. For non-combustible sheds, flame jetting was noted, and this flame jetting was function of size of door, and this jetting resulted in very high local exposures. The lower fuel loading, when we compared the low fuel loading and high fuel loading test, the lower fuel loading allowed for higher oxygen availability within the shed, and it increased the flame spread within the fuel. This slide shows the schematic of different materials and how they impact exposures. So the wood shed, because the wood is consumed in the fire, it opens up, the burning of the fuel loading is then exposed quasi-uniformly to the surrounding combustibles. For the plastic shed, in addition, because the plastic will deform, melt, and expose the fuel loading, the plastic also has additional fire hazard of melting and the pool burning, and the melt flow of the plastic will carry the flames to other combustibles that are on the parcel. For the steel shed, because of the structural integrity of steel, the only fire hazard that is to be noted here is the directional high exposure because of the flame jetting. So having learned from different materials and sizes, we gained significant knowledge on how the burning behavior of these different materials affect the exposure to the primary structure or other combustibles on the parcel.
For no wind scenario.
This was for the no wind scenario.
Yes.
So having quantified the burning behavior of sheds, and we call it in technical terms the heat release rate and the heat flux, the second part of the indoor test series was to assess the target structure performance for different exposures from sheds of different sizes, construction materials, and different fuel loadings. The target structure here included the exterior wall, the window, and the roof assembly. Again, these target plus shed experiments were conducted indoors. The target structure was designed with a specific consideration. Annealed glass window, typical of existing building stock in California that may be part of a retrofit hazard mitigation program, was used. We also used vents that are listed in Chapter 7A, and these are approved materials. And the exterior wall was constructed in compliance with Chapter 7A of the building code in California. In the first experiment, a wood closet with 2 wood cribs was placed next to the target structure. And the closet, you can see there is, in this photo, you can see the closet is placed with 0 separation distance between the target structure and the shed. The roof of the closet opens up within 5 minutes of ignition of the wood cribs. And by 6 minutes, the flames are high up and the eaves have already ignited. So as soon as the eaves ignited, we extinguished the fire, and the experiment was ended here. So the primary takeaway from this experiment is if a wooden shed with very low fuel loading is placed next to the target structure, it can cause to compromise the structure within 5 minutes. And this is again in absence of wind. The wind can always accelerate the fire spread and cause major fire hazard. In the next experiment, we tested non-combustible steel closet with high fuel loading of 4 wood cribs. So same closet, but a non-combustible steel material. We increased the fuel loading inside the shed. So instead of 2 wood cribs, here we have more fuel loading, and we have 4 wood cribs. And here you can see that the flames are jetting away from the primary structure here, but this can be impacting on the neighboring structure, which could be 5 feet or less than 5 feet away from this small closet. So again, even if the steel is preventing the primary structure from igniting, it can be a major hazard to the neighboring structure. For the third shed plus target experiment, we tested a non-combustible steel shed facing the target structure with a structure separation distance of 5 feet. And as you can see, the flame jetting from the shed is impinging on the window, and within 7 minutes, the window has ignited, and within 10 minutes, the flames have spread to the eaves and the vent, and the roof is also on fire. And once this happens, the entire structure can get consumed in fire. In the last experiment, we tested a wood closet with no fuel loading. So in this particular experiment, we wanted to see, even if there was no storage in this particular shed, the wood shed, it can still be a fire hazard. So this basically allowed us to study the effects of exposure only from the shed itself. The duration and intensity of exposure is reduced because there is no fuel loading here, but the entire closet is consumed in fire in less than 10 minutes. And here you can see, while the window and the eaves are not damaged, the damage to the wall is significant, suggesting that even the smallest storage unit made up of wood cannot be placed next to the exterior wall. So in summary, having studied the burning behavior of different shed types and placement and orientation, it is important to consider relative position of the neighboring residents for door orientation, and particularly for the non-combustible steel shed where we have the flame jetting. So having gained the knowledge from the indoor experiments, we moved the experiments outdoors to study the effect of wind. And you can see we have a target wall here, the shed, and a wind source. We had a wind machine so that we could study the effect of wind on the plume lean onto the target structure. And you can see it in the next series of slides. So for the outdoor experiments, again, we use the same shed types, the closet, the very small shed. And because we had moved outdoors, we could move on to a slightly bigger shed, and we call it a small shed. So 3 types: the closet, very small shed, and a small shed. And outdoors, we only tested wood and the non-combustible steel sheds. This slide shows the effect of wind on the burning behavior of wood sheds. And as I mentioned earlier, that the wood is wood shed is consumed in the fire, it opens up and exposes the fuel. There is a significant effect of wind on the burning behavior of these sheds. As you can see in this slide here, with the wind, there is a significant lean in the plume of the fire, and the flames are almost touching the target structure. So for the combustible wood shed, the wind has significant effect on the plume lean. In this slide, we show that the wind has very little effect on the plume lean, and this is because we are using a non-combustible steel shed here. And as mentioned earlier, the non-combustible steel structure remains intact while the fuel loading is burning. And again, although there is flame jetting because of the door opening, the wind has minimum effect on the jetting that comes from the non-combustible steel shed. So essentially, the flame jetting, which is a function of door opening, has minimal effect. The wind has minimal effect on the flame jetting. This slide shows the effect of shed sizes. So here we use wood sheds of 3 different sizes. This is the wood closet, the small, very small shed, and the small shed. The closet had 4 wood cribs. The very small shed had 6 wood cribs, and the small shed had 12 wood cribs, i.e. a significant fuel load here. And as you can expect, that the peak thermal exposure increases with fuel loading. This slide shows the effect of shed orientation on the thermal exposures. So for this particular study, we chose non-combustible steel shed, and onto the left, you can see that the steel shed is facing, the door opening is facing the target structure. On the right, we rotated the steel shed such that the door opening is now 90 degrees to the target structure. And although I don't want to go into too much technical details, but this graph shows that once you rotate the door opening, the thermal exposure is almost reduced by half. So this is the key message from this particular slide, that once you rotate the door opening with respect to the target structure, the thermal exposure is significantly reduced. But this is not the case with the combustible wood shed. Even if you change the direction of the door opening, because the wood is consumed in the fire and it exposes the internal fuel burning, the changing in the direction or the orientation of the shed does not affect the thermal exposure to the target structure. So here
Shonali,
you can, yeah.
Can you go back just one slide real quick? I just want to highlight that when we turn the steel shed away from the target structure, we need to make sure we are not facing it towards another structure, a residence of a neighbor, or another fuel that can act as a wick, such as a fence that can carry the fire to our primary residence. So it's not just turn it and you're done. You need to be mindful about, if you're turning it, where is that energy directed?
Yeah, or it could be a neighboring structure. Exactly. Or other combustibles on the same parcel. Yes. So you have to be very careful with how you are turning the orientation of the shed.
Perfect.
Yes, so in this slide, you can see the door opening is facing the target structure. On the right, the door opening is upwind, away from the target structure. But from the plots, you can see that the thermal exposure to the target wall was the same throughout the burn. So for the wooden structures, it doesn't make much of a difference, just changing the orientation, because once the wood is consumed, the burning of the fuel loading will have the exposure to the target structure. This slide shows the effect of structure separation distance on the thermal exposure to the target wall. And on the left, you can see the SSD, which is the structure separation distance, is 10 feet. And on the right, the SSD is increased to 15 feet. And through the measurement of the heat flux, that is the thermal exposure, we show that just by increasing that 5 feet, we have reduced the thermal exposure by 1/3. So that extra 5 feet reduces the thermal exposure to the target structure by almost by 1/3. And this was our last experiment that we did outdoors. And this was to show the effect of target structure construction materials on the ignitability of the primary structure. So on the left here, the target structure was code compliant to Chapter 7A of the California Code, whereas on the right, the wall was not, it is a non-fire hardened wall. So you can see the ignition of the wall occurred at almost in less than 6 minutes. So if you are not being code compliant, the structure can be compromised within 6 minutes from a burning shed. And based on these experiments, we estimated the minimum structure separation distances. And you can see for the closets, the wood and the steel closet, the minimum structure separation distance was estimated to be, the minimum was 10 feet. And for very small sheds, for both wood and non-combustible steel, the minimum structure separation distance is 15 feet.
Shanali, this is for hardened construction.
Yes, this is purely for the code compliant construction that I showed in the previous slide. So again, we did these experiments in a very methodical way, but there are several limitations associated with the source structure, and also limitations of the target structure. I won't go in the details of these limitations, but these are all documented in our report. As I said, the target structure limitations also has the bearing on how you use these technical findings that we report. And for implications, we have one example, and then Alex can talk more about the caution that needs to be taken. So in the appendix of the report, we discuss the 3 different case studies, and we show a community where significantly larger sheds are placed very close to the primary structures. And if they are not close to the primary structure, they are either close to other combustible material components, such as a combustible fence or wood piles, or they could be close to the neighboring structure. So when we apply the HMM, reduce, relocate, and remove, so we can reduce the exposure by choosing the non-combustible steel sheds in place of wood and plastic sheds. We can relocate the sheds, but then you need more space, and which becomes a problem in a high density communities. And if this is not possible, you just have to remove the shed from the parcel. So we discuss all these different approaches in our report. And there are different case studies where we show that if you move it away from the primary structure, you have to be careful that you are not too close to the neighboring structure. In that case, you just have to remove the shed. Again, this is another example of a high density housing community where very large sheds are placed very close to the primary structures. Yes,
Thank you, Sonali.
I can hand it over to Alex, who will talk in more detail about the caution that we need to take for the implementation of the findings.
Yeah, thank you, Sonali. And again, thank you all for having us. I want to stress that the work provided us significant insight in the context of the different shed materials, the different fuel loadings, different structure separation distances. But I do want to highlight, as Sonali mentioned, as we both mentioned, that most of the work done was with Chapter 7A compliant structures. So if you take that table that Sonali showed with the red and the green, and you want to apply it, thank you, to your community, you have to acknowledge that those spacings will have to be significantly larger. How much larger, we do not know, because we don't know the description. If you have very old, worn structure, you're going to need a whole lot more room than if you have something that is relatively ignition resistant, even if it doesn't quite meet Chapter 7A. So that's the challenge with the retrofit, and that's why we chose to go with Chapter 7A, because it's a yardstick that everyone can understand. There are a lot of limitations. Sonali, if you can go to the next page, I just want to highlight a couple of things. As we look at this work, topography was not considered. Orientation of the shed with respect to a corner of a structure, ladder fuels and other fuels between the shed and the residence and the target were not considered. So if you look at the entire matrix, if you really want to do a realistic matrix, we have done this and we come up with literally over 100,000 scenarios for sheds, and we had to focus and be able to provide guidance with nominally less than 24 experiments. So
Alex, can I just interrupt? We also want to highlight that these SSDs are for radiative and conductive exposures, the flame exposures.
That's where I was getting next. Yes.
But we still have to take measures to prevent the structure from ember exposures.
Yes. So that is, I put in the chat a link to our hazard mitigation methodology website, essentially tool for authorities having jurisdiction, where as an HJ, you can go over there and learn about HMM and see why you may want to apply the HMM to your community. And HMM states that you have to harden for embers no matter what. And to give you a sense, what's in Chapter 7A typically represents about a quarter of all the ember vulnerabilities that we have identified. So Chapter 7A is not sufficient in terms of ember hardening, the same way it's not sufficient for flame radiation convection hardening. So the point I want to stress is there is a lot of very good, very useful information here for you. You need to be very mindful how you use it in the context of your community. And we want to stress to you that you should be thinking of this at the community level, not at the parcel level, because of the way fire spreads. We have to really be very mindful that we don't create these fuel corridors where we push fuels to the edge of the parcels and then enable fire to rapidly move from parcel to parcel. So these are some highlights. We have, Shanali, go to the thank you that has the reports. We have 2 test plans and 2 results reports that you can download and look at. And we also have more detailed presentations of the SS structure separation work in our NIST WUI days that you can also go and download. And lastly, before we open it up for questions, I really encourage you to go to the HMM website, the tool that we have created for you for AHJs to help you truly understand fire spread within the community. And I'll mention lastly that we are working on a HMM tool for neighborhoods so that homeowners at a neighborhood level can work together, even if the community itself is not implementing HMM, that homeowners can work together at a neighborhood level to implement HMM. So we're going to stop there. Thank you, Shanali. Thank you all for having us, and open it up for questions. I see MJ has her hand up.
MJ, do you want to just unmute and ask your question?
MJ, you're muted, so we can't hear you.
Well, we can come back to MJ. Let's see. Let's go to the top of the chat here. I think Natalie had a question about wind speed.
Yeah, the way to do these experiments technically, you cannot pick a wind speed because the different source terms, the different sheds with the different fuel loadings, have different amounts of energy that come out. So the plume, if you think of the smoke and flames, have different velocities, different speeds. So what we did is we changed the wind speed for every type of shed, for every experiment and every structural separation distance, to get the plume to lean and hit the target. We didn't want more wind than that because it cools down, but we wanted that plume to lean and create essentially the worst case scenario where the plume leans and hits the target.
Okay. I wrote down a few notes. I believe in the California Fire Code and in Public Resources Code 4291, wood piles, your firewood piles, are required to be 10 feet away from your structure.
Yep.
So I know you partner with the ICC, and I'm just wondering, so they now have the results of your experiment. Is this something that's now at the ICC level about potentially adding sheds into the code? Just like
I think that is, I mean, obviously I cannot talk for ICC,
yeah.
but this is certainly something that I think would be a wise direction to take. Let me make a comment specifically with respect to wood piles, because we have seen this in the field, and it kind of merges the wood pile story with the shed story. We have a wood pile study also, that if you go to our website, you can get the reports and the presentations on wood piles and the research we have done there. But let me specifically tie it together here, because what we have seen in the field, sometimes people use steel sheds to store their wood because it protects it from the rain and they keep the door open so it vents. And this is essentially the experiment that we're doing. We didn't use a wood pile in there. We used cribs for repeatability, but it conveys in context of the hazard. So absolutely, you don't want wood piles near your structure. You don't want wood piles next to your fence, your combustible fence. You don't want wood piles next to your combustible shed, and you don't want your wood piles next to any of your neighbor's stuff.
Yeah, if this was to get into the code, or a local jurisdiction was going to amend their code, this would be a hard one to enforce, because you can buy these sheds at Lowe's and Home Depot.
Yes.
And you don't need a permit. And
no, I was just going to use the bathroom.
Yeah, and you were get it delivered, and there it is. And until the fire department or the building department or somebody like that comes by and sees it, I mean, there's no way to really enforce it. That's the problem. So
I think that, and to us, and by us, I'm putting my fire spread hat on. Fire doesn't care about how it's regulated. We just need to get there.
Yeah.
So even if you don't control the point of sale, if you tie the shed inspection to some other yearly inspection, let's say defensible space or some other purpose that you enable the fire department to put boots on the ground on the parcel, you would have to, of course, get the community aware that, hey, the fact that you can buy it doesn't mean that it is fine. Even if you don't have a permit, you may have a restriction with respect to the placement.
Yeah, it's gonna have to get into the code.
Yes,
And
absolutely.
And I know we have some fire jurisdictions on the call. We have a couple of HOAs on the call, and I kind of have a question. And you can put your hands up or chat or put an answer in the chat. Are any of the local fire jurisdictions thinking about shed amendments in their fire code? Or do any HOAs have something in their bylaws where you can't put a shed in certain places? I'm just wondering, is anybody else is thinking about this, or is it already in the mix? So I don't think Woodside has anything in their code, but Marshall, I think you're on the call. Maybe you can help me out. Any other fire jurisdiction, please just unmute yourself and let me know. And if we have any HOAs on the call, if you can just respond, I'm just really curious.
Denise,
Hi, Dudley.
yes, thanks. We're in an HOA with 205 houses and fairly closely, small lots, houses close together. I'm not 100% sure that we actually have a written regulation against separate structures, although I think we do. But I know that when we, as homeowner association groups, inspect our properties, which we do annually for fuel reduction, for safe vegetation, we also call out things like a playhouse that's close to a house. We have one or two examples of structures that would not be permitted under the kind of code you're talking about, and they were placed either without permission or too long ago to be regulated, but we do point them out to the homeowners and ask for amendments or adjustments.
Yeah, interesting. Well, I think it's kind of been left out, and now with the NIST study, I think maybe jurisdictions and HOAs can start thinking about it. It is complicated because if you move it 15 feet away from your house, that might be towards the property line, and then
That's why you need setbacks. You absolutely need setbacks.
You have to find this perfect place on your property, and nobody, maybe wants to look at these sheds. So I think it's a complicated issue.
And Dennis, this really points to if you have, I'm going to call them postage stamp, if you have very, very small lots, there simply isn't room. It's not safe. There's just no room to put those types of combustibles. That's the reality.
Yeah.
The same way, think of it the same way, you wouldn't allow a homeowner to put 1,000-gallon fuel tank in their backyard. We have to think along the same lines. The fact that it has gone under the radar screen because it is challenging to regulate shouldn't really be, now that we have the science, shouldn't really deter us from doing some of the heavy lifting to put this in there, because you can take care of a lot of stuff, but fire doesn't work that way. You have to take care of everything. And that's what we're seeing with the sheds. And it's not California, it's across the country. We've been seeing sheds causing structures on fire all around the nation, particularly the small ones that are so easy to place, so easy to buy.
Yeah.
So
And
the-
also placement, you know, if say you haven't, some of the pictures you showed were of stucco houses. Granted, there was a lot of wood fences, adjacent, but if you had a wall that had no windows or a section of wall that had no windows, that seems to me, you know, even if you had to be closer than 10 feet, that placing it where there's no window versus placing it where there is a window.
When you look at the fire behavior, again, you have to look at the entire package. Frequently, the wall is the most robust thing. Typically, you know, and I don't want to overgeneralize, but the wall is pretty easy to harden.
Yeah.
The open eaves are much harder. So you can have a good wall with no windows and the house will still burn down from the roof.
Well, especially if it's a single story and it gets into the eave.
Even if it is 2 stories, when you're looking at 16 and 20-foot
16
flame
feet.
lengths,
Yeah, that was
uh,
very interesting.
that's very easy. So, and I want to stress that these are, you know, if you look at the presentation and you look at that one flame length of 16 feet, that doesn't mean that all the sheds unregulated will only give you up to 16 feet. This is for the size that was tested for that experiment.
Yeah.
You can still get a 100-foot shed next to a house unregulated that will give you significantly higher exposures. So, you know, there are limitations, but I think there's a lot of useful information here for you. There are a few questions. MJ put up a couple, one, no, two, and then Dudley has a couple of questions. So let me go through and answer those first, and then we'll go to Michael and Bob. So let's go to MJ. What if the shed is built to 7A? Well, the steel, you can think of the steel shed as 7A. It's non-combustible. It's very, you know, it's a very robust construction. But the shed has a door, and all the experiments are done with door open because there is no guarantee that the door will be closed. And in some cases, people intentionally leave the door open. Like in the example I gave where people storing firewood, they leave the door open because they don't want things to rot in there. So it's not, that's not an engineering solution to hope that the door is closed so that your house doesn't burn down or your neighbor's house doesn't burn down. So I think that takes care of that.
Alex, also the important point here is even if the door is closed, the surface fire, not always you have a non-combustible
Shed.
flooring.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
the fire can spread from there. The fire can also start with the ember coming from the roof. Also,
Yes. So the best case is a steel shed with door closed. You will still have some exposures. It won't spread the same way, but you cannot guarantee that. And then for all the other, and I'm going to say non-steel, I'm not going to say non-metallic because aluminum was going to melt. For the non-steel sheds, door open, door closed, going to make very little bit of difference. There were some questions by Dudley with respect to larger units, and that migrates into our phase 2, which is the ADUs, RVs and ADUs, which are coming in the future. So there's definitely, you know, we are aware that this is an issue. We're working towards that, but we have identified, as I mentioned at the beginning, this issue with respect to listed vents that we need to sort out. That is referenced in chapter 7. So we're working that before we go to phase 2. Michael, I don't remember if you or Bob got there first, but let's start with you.
Thanks. I was just sort of piggybacking on Dudley's question, and one of the issues I see in California, which I think we need to address with our state assembly and Senate, is there's so many state laws that are in conflict with each other. I mean, no offense, but this is a small piece of the problem. There's ADUs, there's the housing element, there's pressure to build like crazy. Lots are being packed with buildings of all kinds, new, you know,
Oh, it spans different scales. Absolutely.
Single
Absolutely.
family lots now are allowed to have 2 houses and 2 ADUs on it. So, and there's no regulation of
But
sheds
it-
of
it-
any type.
Even if you go beyond California, the challenge here with this issue is that it is typically an unregulated product. So across the nation. So people can go and buy those things, put them next to their homes, put them on their decks. And then when Shanali was mentioning the composite, imagine you have this composite shed on your deck, it drips and melts, it ignites, and now you have, a flammable liquid fire that's burning through your deck all the way underneath your deck. So these are very significant hazards. It doesn't detract at all, Michael, as you said. I mean, the issue of ADUs, the issue of housing density, single home versus multifamily, those are additional issues. A lot of them impact existing construction. Some of them impact only new construction. This is across the nation. So we wanted to give some, put some science behind this to enable, in my mind, HOAs, because this is really the target here, local jurisdictions, HOAs, to take this and use it, because I think it's going to be a very hard lift to put this at the state or national level in terms of enforcement. But the local jurisdictions that see the critical need, they are in very hazardous environments, can take this and leverage it and make it part of their hazard mitigation portfolio.
Yeah, I just want to highlight Brian's information in the chat. Brian, did you want to unmute yourself and just kind of verbally summarize what you put in the chat? It's very important information. He's unmuted. No, we can't hear you yet, Brian. Maybe your microphone is not functioning.
We can read the comment.
Yeah, so I'll just go
I can
through it.
read that.
Yeah, so what Brian talks about is that CAL FIRE is updating their statewide field mats program. I'm just reading from the chat. This is the defensible space inspections, and it's now going to include auxiliary structures and tracking them. So if they have a non-compliant auxiliary structure, not having 10 feet of clearance, then the structure is marked, then the whole property is marked as non-compliant.
Let me clarify on this, because I do not know, and maybe someone can clarify. CAL FIRE uses the auxiliary structure definition in the context of what is in Chapter 7A and 49 greater than 120, or they're going to go through and map every small unit. I don't think that that's the intent, but I could be wrong. Obviously, I cannot talk for CAL FIRE.
I'm not exactly sure. That's why I wanted Brian to give us that information. I mean, I do know that it's now, the code is now 0 to 5 feet of of
For everything.
and and so if you have a shed there, you're definitely non-compliant. So
Yeah, but
in the 5 foot zone.
You can put it 5 feet away and it'll still burn your house down.
Yes, exactly. But I mean, the 0 to 5.
Yeah, the Bureau, and that was one of the points that's one of the reasons we picked the 5 foot structural separation distance, because specifically the Bureau of Forestry ruling on that space. So that will add obviously value in certain situations, but that's not sufficient.
Yeah.
So Bob, you've had your hand up.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for this really important work. It's great. I had a couple questions. I've heard you, I think, a couple times express the need to harden against embers and fire. And I was wondering if you could elaborate what you mean by fire in that context. Is it contact with visible flame, or convective heat, or radiant heat, or all the above?
The way we have set up the hazard mitigation methodology is we are binning the hazards into two categories. One is embers, firebrands, that can be, from small to medium size and kind of, accumulate, whether it is, one or you can have a small pile on nooks and crevices on and around the property. And the challenge there is that during events, we have firebrands that can travel for miles, as we know. So there's no shortcut with respect to hardening. We have identified over 40 discrete hardening vulnerabilities that may be present on structures, from the gutters to sealing around penetrations and so on and so forth, most of which are not explicitly listed in Chapter 7A. You can look at the HMM website that'll help you with the checklist, walk through all of that. The other part is flames, radiation convection. So significant exposures, typically for prolonged durations, not a few seconds. That's the differentiation. And the flaming exposures, whether they come from the shed, the fence, the mulch pile, the car, the RV, the neighboring structure, they are not binary in terms of their exposure, right? You have a curve, time and magnitude that can vary. But what we want to do is we want to balance that exposure, the flaming exposure, both components, radiation, convection, with the hardening. And the way we do this is first, as we said, we try to remove, uncouple, displace the source term, because a few feet can make a big difference in terms of the reduction. Shonali gave one specific example for one specific case, but you can, within a few feet, you can gain a lot, particularly for those smaller exposures in the context of those sheds. With a house, you're going to need to go significantly further out. But the other thing is the hardening. You can do hardening, but this is not the first choice. And also, if you look at HMM, there are situations where we say, don't bother spending money on the hardening, because those exposures are so severe that you will have a very hard time overcoming those exposures. So HMM tells you there's a sweet spot for hardening. If you go much further out, if you get too close, it's not effective. So that kind of gives you a sense of scale. And for structure to structure, we are saying in the order of 25 to 50 feet is the sweet spot for hardening. If you're closer than 25, it's going to be very hard. If you're further than 50 nominally, you're not. In many cases, you're not going to need it. Again, there are exceptions with respect to topography and so on and so forth.
Thank you. Second question. Is there a reference you can point me to that that looks at the ember vulnerabilities, identifies the ones that aren't covered by Chapter 7A? Is that, you said about?
Yes. If you look at, I put the HMM HJ link in the chat. If you go to that, that will direct you to the HMM report. And in the appendix of the report, we have a comparison with Chapter 7A, NFPA, and ICC that shows you what is where.
Thank you very much.
Or what is missing, more appropriately. Yes.
Thank you.
All right. Do we have more questions out there? You can raise your hand. I'm trying to go through the chat right now. So as people kind of do their final questions in the chat, Alex, I wanted to just ask you, I think this experiment was a brainchild for NIST after you went to the campfire and did your damage assessment with your team. And I think you found that there were some structures that were ignited by these auxiliary shed units. And can you just talk about that just briefly?
Sure. So, we started the campfire study. We had boots on the ground within days of ignition with Cal Fire. Worked through the DINS with the DINS team, and spent 6 months on the ground collecting data. We found a number of sheds, and in some cases, and if you look at the campfire fire progression timeline report, we actually have an example of shed to fence to shed to house destruction in Paradise. But this has been on our radar going back to the witch fire. The camp was an opportunity to collaborate, and Cal Fire helped with some state funds to kickstart this effort. And now we are adding more NIST funds, and the effort is ongoing. So, but I do want to stress that in a way, it's a little hard to say, but we have done the easier part, even though it was very complicated to do the sheds, as Shonali pointed out, indoor and outdoor with wind. As we go up in scale, it gets more challenging because we have limitations in terms of what we can put in our lab. So some of the work going forward will have to be done outdoors, and it gets logistically extremely challenging to do this technically well. So we're still working on it. I mentioned at the beginning, I showed you a slide. Shonali, you can go back if you want to the phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. We burned, and Shonali was involved. We burned a couple of RVs in Texas as part of scoping out the phase 2. But even these 2 preliminary burns indicated that more than likely we will not be able to burn the RVs in our lab because they're just too large. I still think there's a good chance we can burn the ADUs, but I think the RVs are going to be too large. So we're working towards phase 2, but we have to sort out these vents first. So that's the immediate work, and then we'll migrate towards phase 2 and keep growing the source term. So that's that.
Yeah, and you talked about the temporary refuge areas. You're going to be planning some experiments with those?
So with temporary refuge areas, just a quick overview. We issued the escape report, which accompanies the campfire NETRA report, which stands for Notification, Evacuation, Traffic, and TRAs. And we developed the escape report, which is a short guide to help small and intermediate-sized communities use that knowledge, including how to think about TRAs, how to incorporate TRAs in their whole evacuation plan. And now with the U.S. Fire Administration, we are embarking on a national campaign to standardize a fact sheet for TFRAs, temporary fire refuge areas, and a signage. So then you can download it and customize it, put your community logos on it, put your community phone number on it, your community, QR code and all of that. And then, you can post it all around your TRAs. So that is happening, and we're hoping to have these officially out before the end of 2024. They'll be online at USFA and at NIST, and you'll be able to just go download them and customize them. And we are embarking on some research efforts to start working on creating guides for sizing TFRAs and creating a guide for fire shelters for WUI environments, with the ultimate goal of taking both of these guides and putting them into codes, whether it is ICC or NFPA, too early to tell. But the idea is ultimately to get these things in the codes. But it's it's a lot of work. So, but we're starting. We're on it.
Well, great. I think those are going to be great additions to the NIST experiment library.
Yes.
Okay, well, it's almost 11 o'clock, so I want to thank Alex and Shanali for joining us and presenting the summary of your experiments. Very important. I think the visual was important for everybody to see. I think, you know, the info is there, and I think people can start pushing it out, you know, the jurisdictions, the HOAs. We can start using that knowledge and pushing it out. But it seems so, you know, people buy these small sheds, it's such innocuous of a purchase, and then it ends up burning their house down or their neighbor's house. So I think it was very, very useful information for us to see and hear today.
Yeah, you have the reports, you have our presentations from our NIST WUI days. If you have any questions, you can, you know, feel free to always reach back out to us, and we'll keep you informed on all the upcoming work.
Yes, please do, Alex. Really appreciate it. And thank you so much, Shanali, for all your great work.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you for having us.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.